Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at someone you probably recognize, maybe even instantly, Nefertiti.
That famous face on the Berlin bust, right?
Mm.
It's one of the most copied pieces of ancient art. Comes from the workshop of Thutmose, the sculptor.
Exactly. But we're going beyond that iconic image because Nefertiti, well, she was arguably the co-pilot of one of the most radical religious and political shakeups in history.
We're diving deep into the Amarna period. So that's Nefertiti, the great royal wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten. We're talking 18th dynasty Egypt, roughly 1370 to 1330 BC.
And it's worth remembering this was probably the wealthiest period in all of ancient Egyptian history. They really had the means to try something completely different.
Absolutely. The resources were there for a total, well, societal reboot almost.
So our mission today is to sort through this, almost overwhelming mix of evidence we have. There's incredibly powerful imagery that survived, but also these confusing, sometimes contradictory sources.
Right. There's a kind of information overload, but with critical gaps, especially about her ultimate fate.
We want to uncover the truth, or as close as we can get, behind her power, which seems unprecedented, her role in this shift to Atenism and this enduring mystery. Did she disappear? Or did she actually rule Egypt herself as pharaoh?
Precisely. How did a queen, traditionally a consort, achieve that level of authority?
Yeah.
That's the core question.
Okay, let's start with the revolution itself. The whole identity of Nefertiti and Akhenaten is just so tied up with this worship of the Aten.
Yeah, the Aten, the physical sun disk. And this was such a radical break from, centuries of tradition. The established polytheistic system, centered on the state god Amun, just got pushed aside.
It wasn't just adding a god, was it? It was more exclusive.
Oh, very much so. Atenism was exclusivist, possibly even monotheistic. We still debate that. But the key thing was the royal couple positioned themselves as the only way to reach the Aten.
So all religious and therefore secular power flows directly through them.
Exactly. And they showed their commitment very publicly. The pharaoh changed his name. It was Amenhotep IV, became Akhenaten, effective for the Aten.
And Nefertiti took on a new name, too.
Yes. Neferuat Nefertiti. Beautiful is the beauty of Aten, the beautiful one has come. It's all about the Aten.
And this wasn't just talk, was it? They made a massive physical change, too.
Oh, yeah. Around year 4 or 5 of Akhenaten's reign, they literally abandoned Thebes, the traditional religious and political capital for generations.
And built a whole new city out in the desert.
Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, modern Amarna, built from scratch, and defined by these huge open-air temples, designed specifically, to let the sun's rays pour in. No more dark inner sanctums.
That move itself must have been incredibly disruptive. And you mentioned it amplified Nefertiti's status.
It certainly seems to have, building a new world order, effectively. And the evidence for her prominence comes from thousands of these small, decorated stone blocks from the temples. They're called talatat.
Okay, so what did these talatat actually show us about her? How did she break the mold for queens?
Well, just the sheer numbers are frankly astounding. On these fragments, she appears almost twice as often as Akhenaten himself.
Twice.
Really?
Yes. It suggests her presence was considered essential. But it's more than just presence. It's what she's shown doing.
Okay, like what?
She's depicted performing acts that were traditionally strictly reserved for the reigning king, the big one, being shown actively smiting Egypt's enemies.
Wow, okay. That's not a queenly activity, usually. That's pure pharaonic power.
Pure pharaonic power. We also see images of captive enemies decorating the base of her throne. Again, something you'd expect only for the king.
And she had her own religious buildings.
Dedicated structures, yes. Like the mansion of the Benben at Karnak, even before the move to Amarna. It underlines that she wasn't just a passive consort. She was deeply involved, a partner.
Which leads to that idea that maybe by around year 12 she was formally elevated, maybe even to co-regent. It's a strong possibility, suggested by things like the co-regency stela fragments.
Yeah.
It looks like they were presenting themselves as an almost equal pair, partners in this massive religious and political gamble, and turning from her power to, well, her identity. Her name itself is quite evocative, Nefertiti. The beautiful one has come.
And her titles reflected her status during the Amarna years.
Absolutely. We already mentioned Neferneferuaten, beautiful is the beauty of Aden. But also things like Lady of the Two Lands, Mistress of Upper and Lower Egypt. These are significant, powerful titles.
Yet, for someone who was seemingly everywhere on temple walls, her origins are fuzzy, aren't they?
Very fuzzy. We know she had a sister, Unbenret, who appears later, but her parents, that's a big question mark.
What's the leading theory then?
The most widely accepted idea, though it's not explicitly stated anywhere, links her to a very high-ranking official named Ai.
Aye. He becomes important later, right? Even Pharaoh eventually.
The very same. He held the title God's father, which is often interpreted as meaning father-in-law to the king, and his wife, Tay, held the title Nurse of the Great Royal Wife.
Ah, okay. So the title suggests a close connection, even if it's not spelled out as daughter.
Exactly. Given Ai's immense influence throughout this period and beyond, it makes a lot of sense. It's the best fit we have. But yeah, no inscription says, Nefertiti, daughter of Ai.
What we do know for sure is her family with Akhenaten.
Yes, 6 daughters that we know of. Meketaten, who sadly seems to have died young. Then Ankhesenpaten, who later becomes Ankhesenamun.
The wife of Tutankhamun. Crucial figure.
And then 3 more daughters. Neferneferuot and Tekashret, Neferneferur and Setpanra. 6 daughters, no known sons between Nefertiti and Akhenaten.
Now, there used to be a theory floating around that Nefertiti was Tutankhamun's mother. What's the latest on that?
That's one thing we could definitively put to rest, thanks to DNA analysis on the royal mummies. The mummy, known as the Younger Lady, found in KV-35, was identified as Tutankhamun's biological mother, and further DNA work showed the Younger Lady was a daughter of Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, so Akhenaten's full sister.
So Tutankhamun's parents were brother and sister, and Nefertiti
was his stepmother. An important distinction. Dispels that old theory completely.
Right, let's tackle the big one, the mystery. What actually happened to Nefertiti? For a long time, the accepted story was that she just vanished.
Yeah, the standard timeline used to be. She's prominent up until about year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, and then, poof, she's gone from the records.
Leading to all sorts of theories, right? Died in a plague, fell out of favor, disgraced.
All of the above were suggested. And there were these erased inscriptions, defaced images. People assumed they must refer to Nefertiti being purged.
But that turned out to be wrong.
Turned out that those erasures were actually targeting Akhenaten's secondary wife, a woman named Kia, not Nefertiti. So the disgrace theory lost its main pillar of evidence.
So the year 12 disappearance wasn't maybe so clear-cut, but then something really shifted the whole picture, didn't it? A fairly recent discovery.
Oh, absolutely. The game changer came in 2012. It wasn't a huge monument, just a quarry inscription found at Deir Abu Hinnis.
Okay, what did this small inscription say that was so important?
It was dated specifically to year 16, month 4, aka day 15 of Akhenaten's reign. And critically, it mentions the great royal wife, his beloved, mistress of the 2 lands, Neferneferuot and Nefertiti.
Year 16, but Akhenaten only reigned for about 17 years.
Exactly. This was his second to last year. And she's still there, still alive, still holding her full titles as Great Royal Wife.
Wow. So she didn't vanish in year 12 at all?
Not at all. It completely overturned decades of assumptions. As the scholar Athena van der Peer, who worked on it, said, it forced a complete rethink of the final years of the Amarna period.
So if she's still the powerful queen right near the end of Akhenaten's life, what happens when he dies?
Well, this is where the theory of her ruling as pharaoh comes in very strongly.
As this figure known as Neferneferuarten.
Precisely. We know there was a ruler, possibly female, using the throne name Ankheperur Neferneferuarten, who ruled very briefly between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. And the epithet used by this ruler is quite telling, effective for her husband.
Which sounds like something Nefertiti might use, referencing Akhenaten.
Many scholars certainly think so. It fits. If Nefertiti was this pharaoh Neferneferuarten, she likely stepped in immediately after Akhenaten's death.
And what would her rule have looked like? Would she have continued the Aten revolution?
Well, this is where it gets really complex. The evidence suggests that this ruler, Neferneferuarten, actually began the process of reversing the revolution.
Reversing it, after being so central to it.
It looks like damage control, maybe political necessity. There are indications this ruler started making overtures back to the traditional priesthood of Amun, possibly preparing the ground for Tutankhamun's restoration.
And the move back from Amarna?
That likely happened under this brief reign too. Abandoning Akhetaten, returning the capital to Thebes, or maybe Memphis. Basically, trying to stabilize the kingdom after the massive disruption Akhenaten, and yes, she herself had caused. Cleaning up the mess, essentially.
Okay, so Akhenaten dies. Maybe Nefertiti briefly rules, trying to manage the fallout. This must have been a time of huge uncertainty, maybe even chaos.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A crisis of succession, a religious U-turn starting. Egypt might have looked quite vulnerable from the outside.
Which brings us to this incredible document from outside Egypt, doesn't it? The Hittite letters.
Yes. found way up in the Hittite capital, Hattusa, in modern Turkey, recorded in a text called The Deeds of the Hittite King Sippalulium I.
And it contains a letter from an Egyptian queen.
An extraordinary letter. The Hittite king is campaigning near Syria when he receives this message from an Egyptian queen, identified only by the title Dakamunzu.
Dakamunzu, meaning
The king's wife, so
Yeah.
the Egyptian queen regent or widow.
And what did this letter say? It sounds desperate.
It really does. She writes, essentially, "My husband has died, and I have no son. They say about you that you have many sons. You might give me one of your sons to become my husband. I would not want to take one of my subjects, I'm afraid."
Wow. I am afraid. And asking for a foreign prince, wasn't that completely taboo?
Utterly. What's fascinating and frankly shocking here is that New Kingdom Egyptian royal women never married foreigners. Ever. It was unthinkable. Pharaoh might take foreign wives, but Egyptian princesses and queens did not marry out.
So for her to break that rule, she must have been terrified.
Terrified, yes, and likely facing immense internal pressure. That line, "I would not want to take one of my subjects," suggests she feared being forced into marriage with a powerful Egyptian man. Perhaps someone like the Grand Vizier Ai, our old friend.
The man suspected of being her father.
Possibly. It signals a deep political crisis, a real fear of losing control completely.
So who was this desperate Dakamunzu? Who fits the timeline?
Well, the timing is tricky. Candidates include Meretanten, Nefertiti's eldest daughter who might have briefly held power, or Ankhesenamun after Tutankhamun died young. Both scenarios involve succession chaos.
But there's an argument for Nefertiti herself.
Yes, the Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves makes a strong case for Nefertiti being Dakamunzu. His argument is, who else but Nefertiti had been depicted for years with near pharaonic power?
Ah, so she had the established authority, the precedent, to make such a bold, unconventional move.
Exactly. She was one used to wielding power alongside the king. If anyone felt entitled and desperate enough to try and secure her position this way, Reeves argues it was Nefertiti, perhaps ruling as Neferneferuaten.
What happened with the request? Did the Hittites send a prince?
Sippaluliuma was suspicious, understandably. He hesitated, sent envoys. Eventually, he did send one of his sons, Prince Sinansa. He never made it. Sinansa died en route to Egypt, likely murdered, probably by Egyptian factions who did not want a Hittite on the throne. A tragic end to a desperate diplomatic gamble.
So we have this picture of immense power, religious revolution, maybe even ruling as pharaoh, desperate diplomacy. But the final, concrete piece is missing, isn't it? Her body. The search for Nefertiti's mummy.
It remains one of the great ongoing quests in Egyptology. The ultimate cold case, perhaps.
Where should she have been buried? Did they plan for it in Amarna?
Yes, the original intention, laid out in Akhenaten's boundary stele decreeing the city, was for the royal family, including Nefertiti, to be buried in the royal wadi at Amarna. There's a royal tomb, TA-26, with annexes, and another huge unfinished tomb, TA-29, that might have been intended for her.
But given the move back from Amarna after Akhenaten's death,
It seems highly unlikely she was ever permanently interred there. The city was abandoned, the project unfinished, so the search moved, logically, to the Valley of the Kings in Thebes.
and for a while there was hope with two mummies found in tomb KV35, right? The elder lady and the younger lady.
That's right. Discovered by Victor Loret way back in 1898. For decades, these two unidentified female royals were prime candidates. Could one be Nefertiti?
But science stepped in again.
DNA testing ultimately provided answers, just not the one people hoped for regarding Nefertiti. The elder lady was definitively identified as Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother. They even found a lock of her hair in Tutankhamun's tomb that matched.
Okay, so Tai, what about the younger lady?
As we mentioned earlier, the younger lady was confirmed as a Tutankhamun's biological mother and also a daughter of Amenhotep III and Tai. So Akhenaten's sister, but not Nefertiti.
So the two most famous possibilities in KV35 were ruled out. Did the search stop there?
Oh no, the speculation never stops. There was huge excitement in 2015 when Nicholas Reeves proposed, based on high-resolution scans of Tutankhamun's tomb walls, KV62, that there might be hidden doorways.
Hidden chambers, leading to her.
That was the theory. The Tutankhamun's relatively small tomb was perhaps just the antechamber to a larger hidden tomb, possibly Nefertiti's original burial, sealed off and forgotten.
That would have been unbelievable.
Absolutely history-making. But sadly, subsequent, more intensive, ground-penetrating radar scans conducted by different teams ultimately contradicted those initial findings. The consensus now is that there are no large hidden chambers of the kind Reeves proposed.
Right, so dash hopes there. Are there any other candidates left?
Well, there's ongoing discussion about mummy KV-21b. This is one of two female mummies found in tomb KV-21.
Okay.
The tomb itself is anonymous, but CT scanning showed KV-21b was likely an 18th dynasty royal woman. Died around age 45. She was found with one arm crossed over her chest in a pose often associated with queens.
But no DNA confirmation.
The DNA attempts so far have been inconclusive or failed to yield sufficient data to make a match. So she remains a possibility, perhaps one of the stronger ones currently, but still unproven. The search for Nefertiti's physical remains goes on.
So Nefertiti's legacy is this incredible mix, isn't it? The face of absolute beauty, known worldwide, but also the driving force behind a religious heresy. A woman who clearly wielded power, usually reserved only for kings, and yet her end story, her final resting place, is still one of archaeology's biggest question marks.
It really is, and I think for you, listening to this deep dive, it really highlights something important about studying history. Sometimes the gaps, the things we don't know for sure, are just as revealing, just as significant as the facts we do have. They show us the limits of evidence, the complexities.
A powerful figure who remains elusive in the end.
Exactly. And perhaps a final thought to leave you with. If Nefertiti did survive Akhenaten, if she was that pharaoh Neferneferuaten, her key actions seem to have been about undoing the Aden Revolution, returning Egypt to Amun, preparing Tutankhamun to rule under the old ways.
What does that tell us about the limits of radical change pushed from the very top, when even one of its main architects, perhaps the queen herself, ultimately chooses tradition over revolution, possibly to save the kingdom itself? It makes you wonder about the true staying power of such top-down transformations.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are wrestling with a policy that seems so simple on the surface, but wow, it gets complicated fast. We're talking about the minimum wage.
It really does, and it's everywhere, isn't it? I mean, the definition is straightforward. It's a price floor, the absolute lowest legal price an employer can pay someone for their labor.
And almost universal. Our sources say something like, what, over 90% of countries have some form of minimum wage?
That's right. Historically, the idea was pretty basic. Stop the worst kinds of exploitation, think sweatshops in the early industrial era, keep people from being utterly ground down.
But today the goals seem much bigger, right? It's framed more around reducing poverty, tackling inequality.
Exactly. Much broader social aims now. But that's where the conflict really kicks in immediately.
Yeah, the central tension. Is it this vital social safety net? Does it genuinely lift people's living standards? Or does it backfire? Does it mess with the labor market so much that it actually causes unemployment, especially hurting the lowest skilled workers it's supposed to protect?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the $15 an hour question these days. And honestly, decades of debate, tons of research, and it's still fiercely contested.
Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to try and unpack this. We'll look at the, frankly, pretty bizarre history of how we even got wage laws.
It's not what you'd expect.
Then we'll dig into the core economic arguments, the models that clash head-on.
The textbook versus the more modern views.
And finally, we'll wade into the empirical evidence, the actual studies. Why is the data so messy? Why can different economists look at the same reality and come to, well, opposite conclusions?
It's a fascinating puzzle. And yeah, the history, it starts completely upside down from how we think about it now.
Right, you said it doesn't start with a floor, but a ceiling. Take us back. Way back, 1549.
Yeah, imagine medieval England. The Black Plague has just ripped through the country. Maybe a third, maybe even half the population is gone, just vanished.
Catastrophic.
Utterly. But think about the economic consequence. Suddenly, there's a massive labor shortage. If you're a peasant, a laborer who survived, your bargaining power just went through the roof.
Because landowners desperately needed workers for their fields.
Desperately. And so, wages started soaring. Workers could demand more, and landowners had little choice but to pay or watch their harvests rot.
So the folks in charge, the wealthy landowners, the nobility, they panicked.
Big time. Their whole economic world was being upended. So King Edward III steps in and issues the Ordinance of Laborers. And this is the key point. It wasn't a minimum wage to help workers. It was a maximum wage.
A ceiling. To stop wages from rising.
Precisely. It legally forbade employers from paying more than pre-plague levels, and it punished workers who demanded more. It was entirely about protecting the wealth and power of the landowners, keeping labor costs down, anti-worker, plain and simple.
That's incredible. So the very first major state intervention in wages was designed to suppress them. How does that eventually flip into the idea of a minimum, a floor?
It was a really slow, gradual evolution. The idea that the state could regulate wages kind of stuck around. Over centuries, subsequent laws and amendments tinkered with the system. Eventually, you get to the 17th century, and some local bodies that were initially set up to enforce maximum wages also started setting minimums.
Ah, okay.
And the goal started shifting. People began talking about ensuring a living wage, enough for workers to actually survive on. This gets formally recognized, for example, in 1604 with an act fixing a minimum wage specifically for textile workers. But that was still pretty localized.
So when does the modern concept, the national minimum wage as social policy, really take off?
You have to jump forward quite a bit. To the late 19th century, the pioneers were actually in the Southern Hemisphere. New Zealand brought in a form of minimum wage legislation in 1894,
Okay.
and Australia followed very closely in 1896. And this time, the motivation was clearly what we recognize today, pushing back against sweatshop conditions, against that extreme exploitation happening in the new factories.
So it's about fairness, worker protection, giving them a bit more power.
Yes, exactly. Helping workers become more self-sufficient, less dependent on charity or parish relief. That's the root of the modern minimum wage movement.
But we have to address a darker side to the story, especially in the U.S. context. Around that same time, our sources point out that some early arguments for a minimum wage in America had, well, let's just say deeply problematic motivations.
Yes, and it's really important not to whitewash this part of the history. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, the U.S. was in the grip of the eugenics movement, these awful ideas about racial purity and undesirable populations.
And how did the minimum wage get tangled up in that?
Disturbingly, some prominent economists and social reformers who supported a minimum wage did so with an explicit eugenicist rationale. They argued that setting a wage floor high enough would effectively price certain workers out of the labor market.
Which workers?
They were targeting groups they considered unfit or undesirable. This often meant recent immigrants, Black Americans, people with disabilities. The thinking was, if these groups couldn't get jobs because employers wouldn't pay them the minimum, they wouldn't be able to support themselves, wouldn't thrive, wouldn't reproduce. It was seen by some as a tool for social engineering, for removing certain people from the workforce.
That is chilling. A policy that many today see as fundamentally about justice and fairness was, for some of its early proponents, about exclusion and discrimination.
It really underscores how a policy tool itself isn't inherently good or bad. Its intent and impact depend hugely on the context and the goals of those wielding it. And it makes understanding the economic arguments even more crucial.
Okay, let's pivot to that economic showdown then, because this is where the core of the modern debate lies. You open Econ 101, and what does it tell you about the minimum wage?
The textbook picture is crystal clear and pretty negative. It uses the standard supply and demand model. Model 1, let's call it.
Right, the graph we all had to draw. You treat labor like any commodity, like apples or widgets. There's a supply curve, workers willing to work, and a demand curve, employers willing to hire. They intersect at the equilibrium wage, the market rate.
Exactly. Let's say the market equilibrium for low-skilled labor is $10 an hour. Now the government comes in and says, nope, you have to pay at least $15. That's your price floor, set above the equilibrium.
And the model predicts
trouble. At $15 an hour, employers find labor more expensive, so they demand less of it. They'll hire fewer workers than they would have at $10. At the same time, more people are willing to work for $15 than for $10, so the supply of labor goes up.
Less demand, more supply. That means a surplus.
A surplus of labor, which, in plain English, is unemployment. The argument is that the minimum wage forces employers to lay off workers or not hire new ones they otherwise would have.
And specifically, it hits the least productive workers hardest, right? The ones whose actual contribution might only be worth, say, $12 an hour. Now the employer has to pay them $15, so it's a loss.
That's the classic argument. It prices the lowest skilled, the least experienced, the most marginalized workers right out of a job. It seems neat, logical, almost undeniable on that simple graph.
But if it were that simple, that universally true, surely we wouldn't still be debating this policy so intensely. Why didn't that model just end the discussion 50 years ago?
Great question. It's because that simple model relies on some pretty big assumptions. The main one is the assumption of perfect competition in the labor market.
Meaning workers and employers have equal power, perfect information, people can easily switch jobs, lots of employers competing for workers.
All of that. And economists started asking, does the real world actually look like that, especially for low-wage workers? And the answer increasingly was probably not.
So what's the alternative view, Model 2?
Model 2 introduces the concept of monopsony, or more realistically, monopsonistic competition.
Okay, monopoly is a single seller. Monopsony is a single buyer.
Essentially, yes. Or at least buyers, employers in this case, having significant market power over the sellers, the workers. Think about a small town dominated by one large factory, or maybe just a few fast food restaurants hiring similar workers.
Workers don't have many options.
Exactly. Finding a new job might mean moving, learning new skills, facing high search costs. There isn't perfect mobility. Employers know this, so they don't have to pay the workers their full marginal revenue product, what they're truly worth to the company. They can pay less because where else are the workers going to go easily?
So the employers have wage-setting power. They can push wages down below the theoretically competitive level.
Precisely. Workers are getting paid less than they should be in a perfectly competitive world. Now, in this scenario, introducing a minimum wage can have a completely different effect.
How so?
If the minimum wage is set moderately, say, somewhere between the low monopsony wage the employer was paying and the worker's actual productivity value, it can actually force the employer to behave differently.
Instead of cutting jobs.
It can actually lead to an increase in employment up to a certain point. The employer was hiring fewer workers than optimal because they were keeping wages artificially low. The minimum wage removes their ability to do that for the lowest paid roles. It pushes the wage up, makes hiring those workers more attractive relative to keeping wages suppressed, and they might end up hiring more people to reach the optimal level at that mandated wage.
Wow. Okay, so the minimum wage acts as a counterweight to the employer's power, potentially boosting both wages and jobs. That's completely opposite to the textbook story.
It is. And it suggests that a moderate increase might not have those negative employment effects the simple model screams about. It crucially depends on how much market power employers actually have.
And there's another criticism of the simple model, isn't there? About looking at just one market.
Right. The textbook model usually assumes a single unified labor market. But economists like Gary Fields pointed out, that's not realistic either. You usually have at least two sectors. The covered sector, where the minimum wage law applies, like fast food, retail, and the uncovered sector, like agriculture, domestic work, maybe the informal gig economy.
So what happens then?
If the minimum wage rises in the covered sector and some jobs are lost there, those workers don't just disappear. They might move over to the uncovered sector looking for work,
Which increases the labor supply in the uncovered sector.
driving wages down there. So the overall employment number might not change much, but you haven't really solved the poverty problem. You've just shifted it around, potentially making things worse for workers in the sectors not protected by the minimum wage.
So even theoretically, it's ambiguous. It depends on employer power. It depends on multiple sectors. No wonder the theory alone doesn't settle it.
Exactly, which is why everyone eventually turns to the empirical evidence. Let's look at the real world. Let's measure what actually happens.
And this is where things get really messy, right? The academic battlefield.
Oh, yeah. For a long time, maybe up until the early 1990s, there was a sort of fragile consensus among economists leaning towards the classic model. Most believed minimum wages probably did reduce employment, especially for young people and low-skilled workers. It wasn't seen as a great anti-poverty tool.
But then came the earthquake.
Then came Card and Kruger. David Card and Alan Kruger, two highly respected economists. In 1992, they published a study that just blew the doors off the consensus.
This is the famous New Jersey-Pennsylvania study.
That's the one. It was beautifully simple in its setup, what economists call a natural experiment, or a quasi-experiment. New Jersey decided to raise its state minimum wage quite significantly, from $4.25 to $5.05 an hour.
Okay.
Right next door, Pennsylvania decided not to raise its minimum wage. It stayed at $4.25. You have a perfect comparison group.
You can look at similar businesses right across the state line. Yeah.
Exactly. Card and Kruger focused on the fast food industry, a big employer of minimum wage workers. They surveyed hundreds of restaurants in New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania before the wage hike in NJ, and then again several months after.
And standard theory predicted what? Fewer jobs in New Jersey restaurants compared to Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. Clear prediction. Employment growth should be slower or maybe even negative in New Jersey relative to Pennsylvania because labor just got more expensive there.
And what did they find?
Their initial results, based on calling up managers and asking about staffing levels, were stunning. They found no evidence of job loss in New Jersey. In fact, their data suggested a slight increase in employment in New Jersey fast food restaurants compared to Pennsylvania.
An increase. So the minimum wage hike was correlated with more jobs.
That's what their first pass suggested. It directly contradicted the textbook model and decades of prior assumption. Their book, Myth and Measurement, became incredibly influential and controversial. It basically launched the modern minimum wage debate as we know it.
I can imagine the reaction. That must have sent shockwaves through the economics profession.
Oh, absolutely. It was huge. And immediately, it drew criticism. Other economists, notably David Newmark and William Washer, jumped on the study. They questioned the methodology relying on surveys of managers who might misremember or misreport staffing numbers.
What did they do differently?
Newmark and Washer got access to actual payroll data from a sample of restaurants. So not what managers said, but the actual records of hours worked and employees paid.
And their analysis of the payroll data showed.
They found the opposite of Card and Kruger. Their analysis suggested that the New Jersey minimum wage hike did lead to a decrease in employment relative to Pennsylvania.
So the data war began right there. Same event, different data sources, different results.
Precisely. And it highlights a fundamental problem in this kind of research. It's incredibly difficult to isolate the specific effect of the minimum wage from everything else happening in the economy. You've got local booms and busts, seasonal hiring patterns, changes in consumer demand, new technologies coming in. Trying to statistically filter all that out to find the pure minimum wage effect is really, really hard.
So where does that leave us now? It's been 30 years since Card and Kruger. We've had countless more studies, more data, more sophisticated methods. Is there any consensus today?
It's complicated. The old consensus is definitely broken. You won't find many economists today who confidently assert, like they might have in the 80s, that minimum wages always cause significant unemployment. But a new consensus is still debated.
Okay, what's the general drift, though, if you look at the big picture?
If you look at meta-analyses, these are studies that try to synthesize the results of hundreds of individual minimum wage studies, particularly from developed countries like the US, UK, Canada. A general picture does emerge.
And that is?
After controlling for various study designs, and importantly, correcting for publication bias, the tendency for studies showing statistically significant effects to get published more often, many recent meta-analyses find that the impact on employment is surprisingly small.
Small? Like how small?
Often, the estimated effects are statistically indistinguishable from zero. Economists talk about the elasticity of labor demand with respect to the minimum wage. An elasticity of zero means a change in the wage has no effect on the quantity of labor demanded, employment. Many modern estimates cluster very close to zero.
Okay, let's break down elasticity near zero for everyone listening. What does it actually mean in practice? If a city raises its minimum wage by, say, 10%.
An elasticity of -0.1, for example, which is a common kind of estimate in recent literature for overall employment, would mean that a 10% increase in the minimum wage leads to only a 1% decrease in employment for the affected group. An elasticity of zero means that 10% increase leads to, well, a 0% change in employment.
So very small job losses, or potentially none at all, on average.
Yeah. That seems to be where a lot of the recent evidence points for moderate increases in developed economies. At the same time, these studies consistently find that minimum wage hikes do significantly increase the earnings of low-paid workers who keep their jobs.
So the takeaway is, maybe the trade-off isn't as harsh as the simple model suggests. You get higher wages for many with minimal overall job destruction.
That's the optimistic reading of much of the recent literature, yes. But, and this is a huge but minimal overall effect doesn't mean no negative consequences or that everyone benefits. The details really matter.
Right. Things are never that clean. Let's talk about those nuances. The Seattle study from 2017 is often brought up as a cautionary tale, isn't it? They went for a pretty high wage, $13 an hour at the time.
Yes, the University of Washington study on Seattle's phased-in minimum wage increase is crucial. They had incredibly detailed data covering not just employment, but actual hours worked and total earnings for low-wage workers.
And what did they find when the wage hit $13?
They found something quite worrying. While the hourly wage went up, as expected, businesses responded by significantly cutting worker hours. So people were earning more per hour, but working fewer hours.
And the net effect on their paychecks?
For the lowest wage workers, total earnings actually decreased on average. They ended up taking home less money overall, even though their hourly rate was higher.
Ouch. So the policy backfired in terms of actual income for the target group?
In that specific instance, for that significant jump to $13, the evidence suggested it did. It showed that employers might adjust not just by firing people, but by reducing hours, which can have the same negative impact on a worker's total income.
That's a really important wrinkle. What about the cost? Who pays for the wage increase, if not through job cuts or hour reductions? Does it just get passed on to consumers?
That's another major pathway. And yes, there's strong evidence that happens, especially in industries with lots of minimum wage workers, like restaurants.
You mentioned a McDonald's study.
Yeah, a study looking at Big Mac prices across the U.S. between 2016 and 2020 found a pretty clear link. A 10% increase in the local minimum wage was associated with about a 1.4% increase in the price of a Big Mac.
So companies aren't necessarily absorbing the cost out of their profits. They're passing at least some of it on to customers in the form of higher prices.
Exactly, which means that the real wage gain for the minimum wage worker is less than the nominal gain. Their paycheck goes up, but the cost of things they buy also goes up slightly, eroding some of that purchasing power.
Okay, so we have potential job losses, potential hour reductions, potential price increases. It seems like a complex web of effects. How does something like the Congressional Budget Office try to synthesize all this when looking at a big proposal, like the $15 federal minimum wage idea?
The CBO projections are always interesting because they try to balance these competing effects based on the broad range of economic studies. Their 2021 report on a hypothetical federal $15 minimum wage by 2025 really illustrated the trade-offs starkly.
What were their headline numbers?
On the positive side, they estimated it would lift about 900,000 people out of poverty. A huge number, a significant social benefit.
But the downside?
They also projected it would lead to a reduction in employment of approximately 1.4 million people. So nearly a million people moved out of poverty, but potentially 1.4 million fewer jobs available overall compared to a scenario without the wage hike.
Wow. That puts the dilemma in sharp focus, doesn't it? A clear win for some, a clear loss for others?
It really does. It shows that even if the net effect on total national income might be debated, the policy creates distinct winners and losers. And that 1.4 million job reduction figure, even if it's just a projection, is a serious potential cost that policymakers have to weigh. It's not evenly distributed pain.
Absolutely. Okay, let's broaden out from just wages and employment. What are some of the other consequences, positive and negative, that come up in the debate?
Well, on the positive side, proponents obviously stress the improved standard of living for those who get the raise, the reduction in poverty and inequality we just discussed.
Makes sense.
They also argue it can boost worker morale and productivity. Happier workers might stick around longer, which reduces costly turnover and training for businesses.
Okay, lower turnover, that's a potential saving for firms.
And some argue it can actually spur innovation. If low-skilled labor becomes more expensive, businesses have a stronger incentive to invest in technology, in automation, in finding more efficient ways to do things.
But that cuts both ways, right? The flip side of encouraging automation is replacing workers with machines.
Exactly. That's a major concern on the negative side. Minimum wage hikes might accelerate the adoption of things like self-checkout kiosks, automated ordering systems, maybe even robotics in warehousing or cleaning. These directly replace jobs often held by low-skilled workers.
And it potentially makes it harder for people to get that first rung on the ladder, doesn't it? If entry-level jobs are automated away.
That's a key argument. It might disproportionately harm younger workers or those with fewer skills or less experience by essentially eliminating the jobs where they could have gained that initial experience and built a work history. They're competing against a machine that now looks cheaper relative to the mandated wage.
Are there any other, maybe less obvious, social impacts? I think our sources mentioned some links to health and crime.
Yeah, some interesting research there. Some studies have found correlations between minimum wage increases and positive social outcomes. For instance, a decline in the growth rate of suicides has been linked to minimum wage hikes.
Really? How might that work?
The theory is increased economic security and reduced financial stress can have positive effects on mental health for vulnerable populations. Similarly, other studies have found that higher minimum wages are associated with reduced recidivism, meaning fewer ex-prisoners reoffending specifically for property and drug crimes.
So, providing a legal, even if minimal source of income stability might reduce the pressure to turn back to crime.
That's the hypothesis. Giving people a foothold in the formal economy, even at the minimum wage level, could offer a viable alternative to illegal activities driven by desperation. So, potential benefits for public health and safety, too.
Fascinating. So given all this complexity, economic ambiguity, mixed empirical results, these wider social effects, how do different countries actually implement minimum wage policies? Is it always just a law passed by the government like in the US or the UK?
Not at all. That legislative approach is common, but there's a completely different model used in several very successful high-income countries, particularly in Scandinavia and parts of Europe.
Which countries are those?
Think about Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Italy, Austria. None of them have a statutory government-mandated national minimum wage law.
No minimum wage law at all. How do they protect low-wage workers then?
They rely heavily on a system of collective bargaining. Essentially, powerful trade unions negotiate wages directly with employer associations, industry by industry, sometimes region by region.
So unions and business groups hammer out the minimum pay rates themselves.
Exactly. These collective agreements are legally binding and typically cover a very large percentage of the workforce, even non-union members in those sectors. They effectively set wage floors, but through negotiation rather than legislation. The argument is that this allows for more flexibility, tailoring wages to the specific conditions of different industries.
Interesting. So different ways to achieve a similar goal.
Yeah.
Now, what about alternatives? If the minimum wage is such a blunt or controversial tool, what else do economists propose to help low-income workers or reduce poverty?
There are several main alternatives that get discussed. Probably the most prominent one, especially in U.S. policy debates, is the refundable tax credit approach.
Like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC.
Precisely. The EITC provides a wage subsidy through the tax system, primarily to low and moderate income working families with children. The key argument for it, compared to the minimum wage, is that it's much better targeted at reducing poverty.
How so?
Well, the minimum wage benefits anyone earning it, regardless of their household income. That includes, say, a teenager from a wealthy family working a summer job. They get the raise, but it does little to reduce overall poverty. The EITC, on the other hand, is specifically designed to boost the incomes of low-income households. It directs the money where the need is greatest.
And it avoids the potential employment distortions of the minimum wage, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a government subsidy, not a mandate on employers.
That's the idea. It supplements low wages without directly interfering with the price of labor between the employer and employee, hopefully avoiding those potential job losses or hour reductions. Many economists across the political spectrum actually prefer the EITC to the minimum wage as an anti-poverty tool for this reason.
Okay, what other alternatives are out there?
Well, you get into broader social safety net ideas. One that gets a lot of attention is universal basic income, UBI, or a guaranteed minimum income, GMI.
Giving everyone a basic floor of income, regardless of work status.
Yes. The argument here is that providing that basic security fundamentally changes the power dynamic for workers. If you know you won't face utter destitution if you lose or leave a job, you have much more bargaining power. You can afford to turn down exploitative wages, hold out for a better job, or maybe invest time in education or training.
It removes that desperation factor.
Exactly. It gives people the freedom to say no to bad jobs, which theoretically forces employers to offer better wages and conditions to attract workers.
And then there's the perhaps most fundamental solution.
Education and training always comes back to this, doesn't it? If you can provide people with the skills and qualifications needed for higher paying jobs, you tackle the root cause of low wages. They become more productive, their market value increases naturally, and they move out of the minimum wage bracket altogether.
Focusing on apprenticeships, vocational training, access to higher education.
Things like the German apprenticeship model are often cited. Investing in human capital is arguably the most sustainable long-term solution to low wages, though it doesn't provide the immediate relief that something like a minimum wage hike aims for.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, what have we learned from this deep dive? It feels like the minimum wage started almost by accident.
Yeah, from medieval price controls aimed at suppressing wages.
Evolved into a tool against sweatshops, got complicated by some ugly early motivations,
Crashed into contradictory economic theories.
and landed us in a 3-decade empirical war where the data seems to whisper small effects on average, but the real-world consequences, hour cuts, price hikes, job shifts, are incredibly complex and unevenly distributed.
That sums it up pretty well. The old certainty is gone. The debate now isn't really whether it has effects, but what kind of effects, where they show up, and who bears the cost versus who gets the benefit. It's incredibly nuanced.
The consensus definitely fractured around the time of Card and Kruger and hasn't really reformed since.
No, it remains one of the most actively debated high-stakes policy areas. Every time a city or state proposes a significant hike, the same arguments, the same studies, the same uncertainties get trotted out again because the stakes are so high for millions of workers and businesses.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a final thought to chew on. Something maybe looking forward.
The landscape is changing rapidly.
Exactly. We're seeing this huge rise in the gig economy. Uber drivers, delivery workers, freelancers who often fall outside traditional employment structures and minimum wage laws. At the same time, automation is getting smarter, cheaper, and more capable of doing tasks that used to be entry-level human jobs.
Right. Robots flipping burgers, AI handling customer service.
So the provocative question for you is this. In a future where the nature of work itself is shifting so dramatically, with more people in non-standard employment and automation potentially displacing many low-wage roles,
Yeah.
how do policymakers ensure a basic standard of living, a living wage, when the traditional tools like the minimum wage might cover fewer people or become less relevant?
What does a wage floor even mean when employment itself is being redefined? That's the challenge ahead.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time. Okay, let's start with something you might remember, maybe from a science class way back. Picture this, a simple prism, you shine white light through it, and bam, out comes a rainbow.
Right, that beautiful spread of colors.
Exactly. That simple act, splitting light, it's actually the seed for one of the most powerful scientific tools we have. A tool that lets us, well, quite literally, read the universe.
And that tool is spectroscopy. We're doing a deep dive into it today. It is the precise study of color, yes, but it goes way, way beyond just that visible rainbow. We're talking about the entire electromagnetic spectrum and sometimes even more.
It's the science of measuring and interpreting these spectra, these patterns of light or energy.
And our mission today really is to give you the shortcut, the essential knowledge to understand how spectroscopy works as this fundamental exploratory tool. You find it everywhere in science.
Everywhere. The main goal is getting information, right? About the structure, the properties of matter. Could be something tiny on an atomic scale or, something astronomically huge like a distant galaxy.
That's it. And the foundational idea, the really big concept that unlocked so much in physics and chemistry is this. Spectroscopy is the absolute key to understanding the atomic properties of all matter.
Because everything has a unique light signature.
Yeah.
Like a fingerprint.
Exactly, an atomic fingerprint. And spectroscopy is how we read it. It's the only way we know how.
Okay, let's dig into the history a bit, the origin story, because it connects classical optics, Newton, and his prism to the weirdness of quantum reality.
It really does. So yeah, you start with Isaac Newton, 1672. His famous paper on optics, he used that prism, showed that white sunlight isn't pure. It's actually a mix of all the colors.
And he coined the term spectrum for that rainbow he saw.
He did. But Newton saw a continuous spectrum, a smooth blend of colors, one flowing into the next. Things got much more interesting in the early 1800s.
How so?
Well, in 1802, you have William Hyde Wollaston. He built a better spectrometer, a more refined one. And when he looked closely at the sun's spectrum, he realized something crucial.
It wasn't smooth.
It wasn't smooth at all. There were gaps, missing patches, he called them, dark bands interrupting the rainbow.
Okay, so gaps in the light. And then came Fraunhofer.
Joseph von Fraunhofer, yeah. In 1815, a German physicist, he didn't just see the lines, he meticulously cataloged them, found about 600 specific, sharp, dark lines in the solar spectrum.
We still call them Fraunhofer lines, right? Absorption lines.
We do, absorption lines. And that was undeniable proof. Some kind of material, either in the sun's atmosphere or maybe even in Earth's atmosphere, was somehow absorbing very specific colors, very specific frequencies of light.
And that led to the core theory.
That's where it crystallized. The idea that every single element on the periodic table has its own unique, fixed spectral signature. It's defined by the exact frequencies, the exact colors of light it either absorbs or emits.
So if you see those specific lines, that signature pattern,
you know exactly what elements are present in the thing you're looking at. Whether it's a gas in a tube or a star billions of light years away, it's the atomic fingerprint. It's infallible.
that is just a staggering realization.
Yeah.
But okay, identifying elements is huge, but you mentioned quantum mechanics. How did these dark lines become so central to developing that whole field? Was it just about confirming Bohr's model of the atom?
It was more than just confirming it. It provided the critical experimental proof that forced a complete shift in how we understood reality. You see, before we had these precise measurements of spectral lines,
People thought electrons could just be anywhere around the nucleus, orbiting smoothly.
pretty much, yeah, they thought energy could be absorbed or emitted continuously, smoothly changing. But these lines, these discrete lines, meaning they appear only at very specific separate frequencies with gaps in between, they just couldn't be explained by that classical model.
So the gaps were the key.
The gaps, the discreteness, yes. It could only be explained by a really radical new idea. Electrons don't orbit smoothly. They exist in specific fixed energy states or shells, and they don't slide between them, they jump instantaneously.
The quantum leap.
The quantum leap. That idea that energy itself comes in discrete packets or quanta, and that electrons occupy these fixed orbits, that was the absolute birth of quantum mechanics. And spectroscopy, through models like the Rutherford-Bohr model explaining hydrogen's spectrum perfectly, provided the undeniable, irrefutable evidence for it.
Wow. So the absence of light, those dark Fraunhofer lines, fundamentally proved the existence of the quantum world. That's amazing.
It really is. It turned everything on its head.
Okay, so fast forward to today. When we talk spectroscopy now, it's way beyond just visible light and prisms, as you said. How do we organize all the different techniques? You mentioned it's based on the energy source.
Right, that's one major way we classify them, based on the type of energy we're using to poke the material, essentially. And the range is, well, it's genuinely mind-blowing.
So what are we talking about?
We start with the most familiar electromagnetic radiation. That covers the whole spectrum we know: radio waves, microwaves, infrared, the visible light we see, ultraviolet, X-rays, and even gamma rays. They're all just light, but with different wavelengths and energies.
That makes sense. We use different colors of light, broadly speaking. But you also mentioned going beyond light, using particles, or even sound. Why do we need those if light gives us the atomic fingerprint?
Because they tell us different things. Different kinds of energy interact with matter in different ways. So, yes, we use particles. Electrons, for instance, in electron spectroscopy. Neutrons, too.
Why neutrons? What do they show us?
Well, particles have wave-like properties, remember? Their kinetic energy gives them a specific de Broglie wavelength. And neutrons are fantastic because they interact really strongly with the nuclei of atoms, especially light elements like hydrogen.
Which X-rays often just pass right through.
Exactly. X-rays interact mostly with electrons. So if you want to study materials containing lots of hydrogen, like organic molecules, polymers, biological samples, water, neutron spectroscopy is incredibly powerful. It sees things other techniques miss.
Okay, interesting. And sound waves, acoustic spectroscopy.
Yes. Using radiated pressure wave sound. This isn't probing the electronic structure or the atoms directly in the same way. It's telling us about the bulk mechanical properties of the material. How stiff is it? How springy? How does it respond to physical stress? Things like that. Totally different information.
And you even mentioned gravitational waves.
On the absolutely largest scales, yes. Facilities like LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, detect ripples in space-time itself. And believe it or not, the patterns of those waves, their frequency, can be analyzed spectrally to understand the massive events that created them, like merging black holes. So yeah, a spectrum for almost everything.
Incredible. So we've got the energy source light, particles, sound. What's the other way we classify these techniques? You mentioned how the energy interacts with the material.
Right. The nature of that interaction is the second big classifier. The most basic distinction is between absorption and emission.
Okay, absorption is like the Fraunhofer lines, the material takes energy in.
Correct. Light goes in, some specific frequencies get absorbed by the atoms or molecules, and you look at what's missing in the light that comes out the other side. That's absorption spectroscopy. Classic technique.
And emission is the opposite. Material gives energy out.
Exactly. This can happen spontaneously, like the glow from a hot object, that's its thermal or black body spectrum, which tells you its temperature. Or we can induce emission. We excite the material, maybe with heat or electricity or other light, and then we measure the specific frequencies of light it emits as it relaxes back down. Think of the distinct color of a neon sign, or a sodium street lamp, or doing a flame test in chemistry. That's emission spectroscopy.
Makes sense. Then you mentioned scattering.
Yeah.
Where the radiation sort of bounces off. That sounds a bit different.
It is. Scattering is about how the radiation is deflected or reflected by the material. There's elastic scattering where the light or X-ray or whatever bounces off without losing any energy. It just changes direction.
What's that used for?
That's the fundamental principle behind crystallography. You shoot high-energy X-rays, or sometimes neutrons or electrons, at a crystal. The regular, repeating arrangement of atoms in the crystal lattice scatters the X-rays in very specific directions, creating a diffraction pattern. Analyzing that pattern lets you map out the precise 3D structure of the atoms in the crystal. Hugely important.
Okay. And then there's inelastic scattering.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting for probing energy levels. In inelastic scattering, there's an exchange of energy between the radiation and the material. The scattered light comes out with a slightly different wavelength, meaning a different energy than it went in with.
Why does that happen?
Because the light has either given some energy to the material, maybe causing a molecule to vibrate, or it has picked up some energy from the material. Techniques like Raman spectroscopy and Compton scattering rely on this. Raman, for example, is fantastic for identifying molecules based on their vibrational modes.
Got it. Absorption, emission, elastic scattering, inelastic scattering. Is there one more main type? You mentioned resonance earlier.
Yes, resonance techniques. These are often incredibly powerful and give very high-resolution information. The most famous one is probably nuclear magnetic resonance, or NMR.
NMR. I've heard that, especially related to MRI in hospitals.
Exactly. MRI is basically NMR imaging of the water in your body. The core idea of resonance spectroscopy is tuning into a perfect frequency match. In NMR, you put your sample in a very strong magnetic field. This causes the nuclei of certain atoms, like hydrogen protons, which act like tiny magnets themselves, to align with the field, but they also wobble or precess at a specific frequency.
Like tiny spinning tops.
Sort of, yes. Then you hit the sample with radio waves. If the frequency of your radio waves exactly matches the precession frequency of those nuclei, the resonant frequency of the nuclei absorb that energy and flip their alignment. When they flip back, they emit a radio signal that we can detect.
So it's like striking a bell. Only the right frequency makes it ring loudly.
That's a great analogy, precisely. And the crucial thing is that this resonant frequency is incredibly sensitive to the chemical environment around the nucleus. What other atoms is it bonded to? What are its neighbors? So by measuring these precise frequencies, NMR allows us to map out the detailed structure and connectivity of molecules. It's indispensable in chemistry and biochemistry.
Okay, that clarifies the how. So we have all these methods using different energies, looking at absorption, emission, scattering, resonance. Let's switch focus to the what. What kinds of matter are we actually analyzing with this giant toolbox? Starting small, with individual atoms.
Yep. If you're studying individual atoms, maybe in a gas, you're looking at those sharp atomic spectral lines we talked about earlier. Those lines correspond to electrons jumping between the outer energy shells, the electron orbitals.
And this is how elements were discovered.
Absolutely. Back in the 1860s, Robert Bunsen, yes, of Bunsen-Burner fame, and Gustav Kirchhoff used a spectroscope to look at the light emitted when different substances were heated in a flame. They realized certain elements produced unique sets of bright lines, their emission spectra. And by observing new, previously unknown lines, they actually discovered new elements, like cesium and rubidium. That's the absolute core of elemental identification.
Amazing. But what happens when atoms join up to form molecules? Things get more complicated, but we also get new information, right?
Way more complicated, but yes, much richer information. Molecules aren't just about electron transitions anymore. Because you have multiple atoms bonded together, the molecule as a whole can rotate, and the bonds between the atoms can vibrate like springs, stretching and bending.
And these motions also involve specific energy levels.
They do. Molecules can only rotate at certain specific speeds, and their bonds can only vibrate at certain specific frequencies. These also correspond to discrete energy levels. So molecular spectra are much more complex than atomic spectra, often showing broad bands made up of many closely spaced lines.
So how do we study these motions?
We use different types of spectroscopy. Rotational spectroscopy, which looks at the energy needed to make a molecule spin faster, typically uses microwave radiation. Vibrational spectroscopy, which probes the stretching and bending of bonds, mainly uses infrared light. Raman spectroscopy, which we mentioned under inelastic scattering, is also excellent for studying vibrations.
And studying these molecular spectra was important for other technologies.
Hugely important. In fact, detailed research into molecular energy levels, particularly using microwave spectroscopy, was absolutely critical for the invention of the maser microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, and that, in turn, led directly to the development of the laser. So, understanding molecular spectra had massive technological spin-offs.
Wow. Okay. From atoms to molecules. What about when you get huge numbers of atoms or molecules packed together in solids, like crystals and other extended materials? Does spectroscopy still work?
It does, but it looks different again. In a solid, especially a highly ordered crystal, you have trillions upon trillions of atoms interacting strongly with each other. This causes the individual atomic or molecular energy levels to broaden out and merge into continuous bands of a loud energy.
So you lose those sharp lines.
Often, yes. The density of available energy states becomes very high. So absorption or emission spectra of solids tend to be much broader, sometimes looking more like that continuous black body spectrum we mentioned, related more to temperature than specific electronic transitions.
But crystals have that ordered structure. Doesn't that help?
Ah, yes. While the absorption emission might be broad, that perfectly ordered lattice structure is exactly what makes elastic scattering techniques like X-ray diffraction or neutron diffraction so incredibly powerful for solids. The regular spacing of the atoms acts like a diffraction grating for X-rays or neutrons, producing those patterns that let us map the crystal structure precisely.
So different techniques for different forms of matter. We've done atoms, molecules, solids. Can we go even deeper? To the nuclei themselves.
We absolutely can. The nucleus of an atom also has its own set of discrete, quantized energy states, but these energy levels are much, much further apart than the electron energy levels.
Meaning you need higher energy radiation to probe them.
Exactly. Transitions between nuclear energy states typically involve absorbing or emitting gamma rays, which are the most energetic form of electromagnetic radiation. So gamma ray spectroscopy is used to study nuclear structure, often important in nuclear physics, astrophysics, and certain types of materials analysis.
And NMR fits in here too, right? Nuclear magnetic resonance.
Yes, but NMR is looking at something slightly different. It's not usually about transitions between the main nuclear energy levels, like gamma spectroscopy. It's about those much smaller energy differences created when we put the nuclei in a strong magnetic field, the energy splitting of the nuclear spin states.
Ah, the tiny magnets aligning or opposing the field.
Precisely. That energy splitting typically corresponds to radio wave frequencies. So NMR uses radio waves to probe the immediate environment around specific types of nuclei within a molecule or material. It tells us about chemical structure, molecular dynamics, and it's the basis for MRI, giving us those incredibly detailed images of soft tissues in the body.
Okay, this toolbox is immense. We started this whole deep dive thinking about Newton and a prism on a desk. Let's zoom way out now. Where is all this fundamental science actually being used today in the real world?
Oh, it's absolutely everywhere. It's hard to overstate its importance. Let's start big. Astronomy.
Okay, telescopes.
Pretty much every major research telescope in the world, whether on the ground or in space like Hubble or JWST, has a spectrograph attached. Or often, several spectrographs optimized for different wavelengths. They are completely essential.
Why so essential? What are they telling astronomers?
So much. First, chemical composition. By identifying those atomic fingerprints, the absorption or emission lines in the light from a star, a galaxy, a gas cloud, we can tell exactly what elements are present and even in what abundances. We can also determine temperature and density from the details of the spectra.
So we know what stars are made of, even light years away.
Exactly. But maybe even more crucially, spectroscopy tells us about motion, velocity,
How does that work?
the Doppler effect.
Yeah.
Just like the pitch of an ambulance siren changes, whether it's coming towards you or moving away, the wavelength of light changes too. If an object is moving away from us, its spectral lines get shifted towards longer wavelengths, towards the red end of the spectrum. We call it redshift.
And if it's moving towards us?
Blue shift. The lines shift to shorter, bluer wavelengths. By precisely measuring the amount of this shift for a distant star or galaxy, using the relativistic Doppler effect formula, we can calculate exactly how fast it's moving towards or away from us.
And that's how we know the universe is expanding.
That is fundamentally how Edwin Hubble discovered it in the 1920s, and it's how we continue to map the expansion and the large-scale structure of the cosmos. Measuring redshifts is absolutely foundational to modern cosmology.
Mind-blowing. The ultimate long-distance application. But you said it's everywhere. What about closer to home? Medicine and biochemistry.
Huge applications there, too. Biomedical spectroscopy is a massive field. It's used for analyzing tissues, often non-invasively. For example, pulse oximeters that clip on your finger. They use absorption spectroscopy with red and infrared light to measure oxygen levels in your blood.
Ah, I never realized that was spectroscopy.
Yep. It's used in medical imaging techniques beyond MRI, too. And from monitoring things in real time, like checking the dissolved oxygen content in water for environmental science, or even analyzing the gases a patient is breathing in and out during surgery in hospitals.
Practical and potentially life-saving. What about industrial uses? Manufacturing, quality control?
Definitely. It's vital for non-destructive testing. You need to check the composition of a batch of metal alloy, or verify the purity of a chemical, or monitor the curing process of a composite material. Spectroscopy lets you do that without cutting the sample open or destroying it. X-ray fluorescence, XRF, is a very common technique for rapid elemental analysis in industry, for instance. It's also used for process monitoring, keeping an eye on chemical reactions in real time in industrial plants.
Okay, astronomy, medicine, industry.
Yeah.
Any really surprising or niche applications?
Well, one that caught my eye in the research was using spectroscopy for in ovo sexing.
In ovo, sexing. What on earth is that?
It means determining the sex of a chicken embryo while it's still inside the egg before it hatches.
Yeah.
Apparently, they can shine light through the eggshell and analyze the subtle spectral differences likely related to hormones or other biochemical markers to tell if the embryo is male or female.
That's technically fascinating. Why is that needed?
It turns out it's driven by major ethical concerns and regulations. In commercial egg production, male chicks of egg-laying breeds are typically culled shortly after hatching because they don't lay eggs and aren't suitable for meat production. This practice is highly controversial.
Ah, I see. So this technology allows them to identify and discard the male eggs before they hatch.
Exactly. It avoids the culling of live chicks. Countries like Germany and France actually mandated bans on chick culling starting around 2022, which rapidly accelerated the development and adoption of these in ovo sexing technologies, many of which rely on spectroscopy.
Wow, so fundamental physics, light analysis, Fraunhofer lines, directly leading to a solution for a major animal welfare issue in agriculture. That's quite a leap.
It really shows the incredible reach of the science, doesn't it? From probing quantum mechanics to influencing agricultural practices based on societal ethics.
And is this tech super high-end, or is spectroscopy becoming more accessible?
That's another great point. While the cutting-edge research instruments are obviously complex and expensive, the basic principles of spectroscopy are actually becoming incredibly accessible now.
You mean like for schools or hobbyists?
Yeah.
The sources mention DIY spectroscopy.
Exactly. There's a whole maker movement around it. People are building their own functional spectrometers using really simple, readily available components. Like you can use a piece of a CD or DVD as a diffraction grating to split the light.
Seriously?
A CD?
Yeah. The closely spaced tracks act just like the lines on a proper grating. Combine that with a simple slit, maybe a lens, and then use your smartphone camera as the detector. There are even designs for 3D printed bodies to hold it all together.
And apps to analyze the results.
Right, smartphone apps and open source software can capture the image from the camera, analyze the spectrum, calibrate it, and display the intensity graph. It really democratizes the whole process.
Now, obviously, a DIY smartphone spectroscope isn't going to compete with the Hubble Space Telescope spectrograph. Of course not. The resolution, the sensitivity, the wavelength range, they're orders of magnitude different. But that's not the point. The point is it provides invaluable hands-on educational experiences. You can actually see the discrete emission lines from a neon lamp or the absorption lines in sunlight yourself. It drives curiosity and citizen science initiatives. You can build a tool in your garage that demonstrates the fundamental principles that let us analyze stars.
That really brings it full circle, doesn't it? From Newton's prism through discovering elements in quantum mechanics to analyzing galaxies, checking blood oxygen, sexing eggs, and now building your own in the garage.
It does. We've seen how taking some form of radiation, light, particles, even sound, and just carefully measuring how it interacts with matter gives us this incredibly deep, fundamental understanding of pretty much everything.
The sheer precision is what gets me. That a tiny shift in wavelength or a specific missing color can tell you so much. Identify an atom, map a protein, determine the speed of a galaxy, or even the sex of an unhatched chick. It's almost unbelievable.
It truly is. And that precision, as we saw, was what allowed us to discover elements in the first place and provided the bedrock, the experimental proof for quantum mechanics itself. And the field is never static. It's constantly being refined. Think about databases like the NIST Atomic Spectra database.
Run by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology.
That's the one. They are continually measuring and remeasuring these atomic fingerprints with ever-increasing accuracy and making that data publicly available. Precision is always improving.
So given the spectroscopy has already cracked open so many secrets and enabled entire new fields of science, What's the final thought you want to leave our listeners mulling over?
It's this. Considering the incredible precision we already have, and the fact it's constantly improving, and knowing how it's revealed unexpected things like quantum jumps and enabled applications we couldn't have dreamed of centuries ago, the real question is, what fundamental property of matter, something currently hidden from us, maybe something we don't even have a concept for yet, will the next generation of spectroscopy reveal? What new secret is waiting in the light?